Section 6 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lear of the Steppes, Part 16. The first news with which my valet, Prokofy, greeted me (he regarded himself as the seignorial huntsman) was that there was an immense number of wild snipe on the wing, and that in the birch copse near Eskovo, Harlov's property, especially, they were simply swarming. I had 3 hours before me till dinner time. I promptly seized my gun and my game bag, and with Prokofy and a setter dog, hastened to the Eskovo copse. We certainly did find a great many wild snipe there, and firing about 30 charges, killed 5. As I hurried homewards with my booty, I saw a peasant ploughing near the roadside. His horse had stopped, and with tearful and angry abuse he was mercilessly tugging with the cord reins at the animal's head, which was bent on one side. I looked attentively at the luckless beast, whose ribs were all but through his skin, and, bathed in sweat, heaved up and down with convulsive, irregular movements like a blacksmith's bellows. I recognized it at once as the decrepit old mare with the scar on her shoulder, who had served Martin Petrovitch so many years. 'Is Mr. Harlov living?' I asked Prokofy. The chase had so completely absorbed us that up to that instant we had not talked of anything. 'Yes, he's alive. Why?' 'But that's his mare, isn't it? Do you mean to say he's sold her?' 'His mare it is, to be sure, but as to selling, he never sold her. But they took her away from him, and handed her over to that peasant.' 'How, took it? And he consented?' 'They never asked his consent. Things have changed here in your absence,' Prokofy observed, with a faint smile in response to my look of amazement. 'Worse luck! My goodness, yes! Now Sletkin's master, and orders every one about.' 'But Martin Petrovitch?' 'Why, Martin Petrovitch has become the very last person here, you may say. He's on bread and water. What more can I say? They've crushed him altogether. Mark my words, they'll drive him out of the house.' The idea that it was possible to drive such a giant had never entered my head. 'And what does Zhitkov say to it?' I asked at last. 'I suppose he's married to the second daughter?' 'Married?' repeated Prokofy. And this time he grinned all over his face. 'They won't let him into the house. "We don't want you," they say. "Get along home with you." It's as I said, Sletkin directs every one.' 'But what does the young lady say?' 'Evlampia Martinovna? Ah, master, I could tell you. But you're young, one must think of that. Things are going on here that are oh hey, why Dianka's setting, I do believe.' My dog actually had stopped short, before a thick oak bush which bordered a narrow ravine by the roadside. Prokofy and I ran up to the dog. A snipe flew up out of the bush, we both fired at it and missed. The snipe settled in another place. We followed it. The soup was already on the table when I got back. My mother scolded me. 'What's the meaning of it?' she said with displeasure. 'The very first day, and you keep us waiting for dinner.' I brought her the wild snipe I had killed. She did not even look at them. There was also in the room Souvenir, Kvitsinsky, and Zhitkov. The retired major was huddled in a corner, for all the world like a schoolboy in disgrace. His face wore an expression of mingled confusion and annoyance. His eyes were red. One might positively have imagined he had recently been in tears. My mother remained in an ill humour. I was at no great pains to surmise that my late arrival did not count for much in it. During dinner time she hardly talked at all. The major turned beseeching glances upon her from time to time, but ate a good dinner nevertheless. Souvenir was all of a shake. Kvitsinsky preserved his habitual self-confidence of demeanour. 'Vikenty Osipitch,' my mother addressed him, 'I beg you to send a carriage to morrow for Martin Petrovitch, since it has come to my knowledge that he has none of his own, and bid them tell him to come without fail, that I desire to see him. Kvitsinsky was about to make some rejoinder, but he restrained himself. "And let Sletkin know," continued my mother, "that I command him to present himself before me. Do you hear? I command." "Yes, just so. That scoundrel ought—" Zhitkov was beginning in a subdued voice, but my mother gave him such a contemptuous look that he promptly turned away and was silent. "Do you hear? I command," repeated my mother. "Certainly, madam," Kvitsinsky replied submissively but with dignity. "Martin Petrovitch won't come," Souvenir whispered to me, as he came out of the dining room with me after dinner. "You should just see what's happened to him. It's past comprehension. It's come to this, that whatever they say to him, he doesn't understand a word. Yes, they've got the snake under the pitchfork." And Souvenir went off into his revolting laugh. Part 17. Souvenir's prediction turned out correct. Martin Petrovitch would not come to my mother. She was not at all pleased with this, and dispatched a letter to him. He sent her a square bit of paper, on which the following words were written in big letters: "Indeed I can't. I should die of shame. Let me go to my ruin. Thanks. Don't torture me. Martin Harlov." Sletkin did come, but not on the day on which my mother had commanded his attendance, but 24 hours later. My mother gave orders that he should be shown into her boudoir. God knows what their interview was about, but it did not last long. A quarter of an hour, not more. Sletkin came out of my mother's room, crimson all over, and with such a viciously spiteful and insolent expression of face, that, meeting him in the drawing room, I was simply petrified, while Souvenir, who was hanging about there, stopped short in the middle of a snigger. My mother came out of her boudoir, also very red in the face, and announced in the hearing of all that Mr. Sletkin was never, upon any pretext, to be admitted to her presence again, and that if Martin Petrovitch's daughters were to make bold (they've impudence enough, she said) to present themselves, they, too, were to be refused admittance. At dinner time she suddenly exclaimed: "The vile little Jew! I picked him out of the gutter. I made him a career. He owes everything, everything to me. And he dares to tell me I've no business to meddle in their affairs. That Martin Petrovitch is full of whims and fancies, and it's impossible to humour him. Humour him, indeed! What a thing to say! Ah, he's an ungrateful wretch, an insolent little Jew." Major Zhitkov, who happened to be one of the company at dinner, imagined that now it was no less than the will of the Almighty for him to seize the opportunity and put in his word. But my mother promptly settled him. "Well, and you're a fine one too, my man," she commented. "Couldn't get the upper hand of a girl, and he an officer, in command of a squadron. I can fancy how it obeyed you. He take a steward's place indeed, a fine steward he'd make." Kvitsinsky, who was sitting at the end of the table, smiled to himself a little malignantly, while poor Zhitkov could do nothing but twitch his moustaches, lift his eyebrows, and bury the whole of his hirsute countenance in his napkin. After dinner he went out on to the steps to smoke his pipe as usual, and he struck me as so miserable and forlorn that, although I had never liked him, I joined myself on to him at once. "How was it, Gavrila Fedulitch," I began without further beating about the bush, "that your affair with Evlampia Martinovna was broken off? I'd expected you to be married long ago." The retired major looked at me dejectedly. "A snake in the grass," he began, uttering each letter of each syllable with bitter distinctness. "He poisoned me with his fang, and turned all my hopes in life to ashes. And I could tell you, Dmitri Semyonovitch, all his hellish wiles, but I'm afraid of angering your mamma. You're young yet," Prokofy's expression flashed across my mind. "Even as it is." Zhitkov groaned. "Patience, patience, nothing else is left me." He struck his fist upon his chest. "Patience, old soldier, patience. I served the Tsar faithfully, honourably. Yes, I spared neither blood nor sweat, and now see what I am brought to. Had it been in the regiment, and the matter depending upon me," he continued after a short silence, spent in convulsively sucking at his cherrywood pipe, I'd have given it to him with the flat side of my sword, 3 times over, till he'd had enough." Zhitkov took the pipe out of his mouth, and fixed his eyes on vacancy, as though admiring the picture he had conjured up. Souvenir ran up, and began quizzing the major. I turned away from them, and determined, come what may, I would see Martin Petrovitch with my own eyes. My boyish curiosity was greatly stirred. Part 18. Next day I set out with my gun and dog, but without Prokofy, to the Eskovo copse. It was an exquisite day. I fancy there are no days like that in September anywhere but in Russia. The stillness was such that one could hear, 100 paces off, the squirrel hopping over the dry leaves, and the broken twig just feebly catching at the other branches, and falling, at last, on the soft grass, to lie there for ever, not to stir again till it rotted away. The air, neither warm nor chill, but only fragrant, and as it were keen, was faintly, deliciously stinging in my eyes and on my cheeks. A long spider web, delicate as a silken thread, with a white ball in the middle, floated smoothly in the air, and sticking to the butt end of my gun, stretched straight out in the air, a sign of settled and warm weather. The sun shone with a brightness as soft as moonlight. Wild snipe were to be met with pretty often, but I did not pay special attention to them. I knew that the copse went on almost to Harlov's homestead, right up to the hedge of his garden, and I turned my steps in that direction, though I could not even imagine how I should get into the place itself, and was even doubtful whether I ought to try to do so, as my mother was so angry with its new owners. Sounds of life and humanity reached me from no great distance. I listened. Someone was coming through the copse, straight towards me. "You should have said so straight out, dear," I heard a woman's voice. "Be reasonable," another voice broke in, the voice of a man. "Can one do it all at once?" I knew the voices. There was the gleam of a woman's blue gown through the reddening nut bushes. Beside it stood a dark full coat. Another instant, and there stepped out into the glade, 5 paces from me, Sletkin and Evlampia. They were disconcerted at once. Evlampia promptly stepped back, away into the bushes. Sletkin thought a little, and came up to me. There was not a trace to be seen in his face of the obsequious meekness with which he had paced up and down Harlov's courtyard 4 months before, rubbing up my horse's snaffle. But neither could I perceive in it the insolent defiance which had so struck me on the previous day, on the threshold of my mother's boudoir. It was still as white and pretty as ever, but seemed broader and more solid. "Well, have you shot many snipe?" he asked me, raising his cap smiling, and passing his hand over his black curls. "You are shooting in our copse. You are very welcome, we would not hinder you. Quite the contrary." "I have killed nothing to day," I rejoined, answering his first question, "and I will go out of your copse this instant." Sletkin hurriedly put on his cap. "Indeed, why so? We would not drive you out. Indeed, we're delighted. Here's Evlampia Martinovna will say the same. Evlampia Martinovna, come here. Where have you hidden yourself?" Evlampia's head appeared behind the bushes. But she did not come up to us. She had grown prettier, and seemed taller and bigger than ever. "I'm very glad to tell the truth," Sletkin went on, "that I have met you. Though you are still young in years, you have plenty of good sense already. Your mother was pleased to be very angry with me yesterday, she would not listen to reason of any sort from me. But I declare, as before God, so before you now, I am not to blame in any way. We can't treat Martin Petrovitch otherwise than we do. He's fallen into complete dotage. One can't humour all his whims, really. But we show him all due respect. Only ask Evlampia Martinovna." Evlampia did not stir. Her habitual scornful smile flickered about her lips, and her large eyes watched us with no friendly expression. 'But why, Vladimir Vassilievitch, have you sold Martin Petrovitch's mare? I was particularly impressed by that mare being in the possession of a peasant.' 'His mare? Why did we sell it? Why, Lord have mercy on us, what use was she? She was simply eating her head off. But with the peasant she can work at the plough anyway. As for Martin Petrovitch, if he takes a fancy to drive out anywhere, he's only to ask us. We wouldn't refuse him a conveyance. On a holiday we should be pleased.' 'Vladimir Vassilievitch,' said Evlampia huskily, as though calling him away, and she still did not stir from her place. She was twisting some stalks of ripple grass round her fingers and snapping off their heads, slapping them against each other. 'About the page Maximka again,' Sletkin went on. 'Martin Petrovitch complains because we've taken him away and apprenticed him. But kindly consider the matter for yourself. Why, what had he to do, waiting on Martin Petrovitch? Kick up his heels, nothing more. And he couldn't even wait on him properly, on account of his stupidity and his youth. Now we have sent him away to a harness maker's. He'll be turned into a first-rate handicraftsman, and make a good thing of it for himself, and pay us ransom money too. And, living in a small way as we do, that's a matter of importance. On a little farm like this, one can't afford to let anything slip.' And this is the man Martin Petrovitch called a 'poor stick,' I thought. 'But who reads to Martin Petrovitch now?' I asked. 'Why, what is there to read? He had one book, but luckily that's been mislaid somewhere. And what use is reading at his age?' 'And who shaves him?' I asked again. Sletkin gave an approving laugh, as though in response to an amusing joke. 'Why, nobody. At first he used to singe his beard in the candle, but now he lets it be altogether. And it's lovely.' 'Vladimir Vassilievitch,' Evlampia repeated insistently, 'Vladimir Vassilievitch.' Sletkin made her a sign with his hand. 'Martin Petrovitch is clothed and cared for, and eats what we do. What more does he want? He declared himself that he wanted nothing more in this world but to think of his soul. If only he would realise that everything now, however you look at it, is ours. He says too that we don't pay him his allowance. But we've not always got money ourselves, and what does he want with it, when he has everything provided him? And we treat him as one of the family, too. I'm telling you the truth. The rooms, for instance, which he occupies. How we need them! There's simply not room to turn round without them. But we don't say a word. We put up with it. We even think how to provide amusement for him. There, on St. Peter's Day, I bought him some excellent hooks in the town, real English ones, expensive hooks, to catch fish. There are lots of carp in our pond. Let him sit and fish. In an hour or two there'd be a nice little fish soup provided. The most suitable occupation for old men.' 'Vladimir Vassilievitch,' Evlampia called for the third time in an incisive tone, and she flung far away from her the grass she had been twisting in her fingers. 'I am going.' Her eyes met mine. 'I am going, Vladimir Vassilievitch,' she repeated, and vanished behind a bush. 'I'm coming, Evlampia Martinovna, directly,' shouted Sletkin. 'Martin Petrovitch himself agrees with us now,' he went on, turning again to me. 'At first he was offended, certainly, and even grumbled, until, you know, he realised. He was, you remember, a hot-tempered, violent man. More's the pity. But there, he's grown quite meek now, because he sees his own interest. Your mamma, mercy on us, how she pitched into me! To be sure, she's a lady that sets as much store by her own authority as Martin Petrovitch used to do. But you come in and see for yourself. And you might put in a word when there's an opportunity. I feel Natalia Nikolaevna's bound to me deeply. But we've got to live too.' 'And how was it Zhitkov was refused?' I asked. 'Fedulitch, that dolt? Sletkin shrugged his shoulders. Why, upon my word, what use could he have been? His whole life spent among soldiers. And now he has a fancy to take up farming. He can keep the peasants up to the mark, says he, because he has been used to knocking men about. He can do nothing. Even knocking men about wants some sense. Evlampia Martinovna refused him herself. He was a quite unsuitable person. All our farming would have gone to ruin with him. Coo-ee! sounded Evlampia's musical voice. Coming, coming! Sletkin called back. He held out his hand to me. Though unwillingly, I took it. I beg to take leave, Dmitri Semyonovitch, said Sletkin, showing all his white teeth. Shoot wild snipe as much as you like. It's wild game, belonging to no one. But if you come across a hare, you spare it. That game is ours. Oh, and something else. Won't you be having pups from your bitch? I should be obliged for one. Coo-ee! Evlampia's voice rang out again. Coo-ee! Sletkin responded, and rushed into the bushes. End of section 6. Section 7 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lear of the Steppes, Part 19. I remember when I was left alone, I was absorbed in wondering how it was Harlov had not pounded Sletkin into a jelly, as he said, and how it was Sletkin had not been afraid of such a fate. It was clear Martin Petrovitch really had grown meek, I thought, and I had a still stronger desire to make my way into Eskovo, and get at least a glance at that colossus, whom I could never picture to myself subdued and tractable. I had reached the edge of the copse, when suddenly a big snipe, with a great rush of wings, darted up at my very feet, and flew off into the depths of the wood. I took aim. My gun missed fire. I was greatly annoyed. It had been such a fine bird, and I made up my mind to try if I couldn't make it rise a second time. I set off in the direction of its flight, and going some 200 paces off into the wood, I caught sight, in a little glade, under an overhanging birch tree, not of the snipe, but of the same Sletkin once more. He was lying on his back with both hands under his head, and with smile of contentment gazing upwards at the sky, swinging his left leg, which was crossed over his right knee. He did not notice my approach. A few paces from him Evlampia was walking slowly up and down the little glade, with downcast eyes. It seemed as though she were looking for something in the grass, mushrooms or something. Now and then she stooped and stretched out her hand. She was singing in a low voice. I stopped at once, and fell to listening. At first I could not make out what it was she was singing, but afterwards I recognized clearly the following well-known lines of the old ballad: Hither, hither, threatening storm cloud, slay for me the father-in-law, strike for me the mother-in-law, the young wife I will kill myself. Evlampia sang louder and louder. The last words she delivered with peculiar energy. Sletkin still lay on his back and laughed to himself, while she seemed all the time to be moving round and round him. "Oh, indeed," he commented at last, "the things that come into some people's heads." "What?" queried Evlampia. Sletkin raised his head a little. "What? Why, what words were those you were uttering?" "Why, you know, Volodya, one can't leave the words out of a song," answered Evlampia, and she turned and saw me. We both cried out aloud at once, and both rushed away in opposite directions. I made my way hurriedly out of the copse, and crossing a narrow clearing, found myself facing Harlov's garden. Part 20. I had no time, nor would it have been of any use, to deliberate over what I had seen. Only an expression kept recurring to my mind, love spell, which I had lately heard, and over the signification of which I had pondered a good deal. I walked alongside the garden fence, and in a few moments, behind the silver poplars (they had not yet lost a single leaf, and the foliage was luxuriantly thick and brilliantly glistening), I saw the yard and 2 little lodges of Martin Petrovitch's homestead. The whole place struck me as having been tidied up and pulled into shape. On every side one could perceive traces of unflagging and severe supervision. Anna Martinovna came out onto the steps, and screwing up her blue-grey eyes, gazed for a long time in the direction of the copse. 'Have you seen the master?' she asked a peasant who was walking across the yard. 'Vladimir Vassilitch?' responded the latter, taking his cap off. 'He went into the copse, surely.' 'I know he went to the copse. Hasn't he come back? Haven't you seen him?' 'I've not seen him, nay.' The peasant continued standing bareheaded before Anna Martinovna. 'Well, you can go,' she said. 'Or no, wait a bit. Where's Martin Petrovitch, do you know?' 'Oh, Martin Petrovitch!' answered the peasant in a sing-song voice, alternately lifting his right and then his left hand, as though pointing away somewhere, 'is sitting yonder at the pond with a fishing rod. He's sitting in the reeds with a rod, catching fish maybe, God knows.' 'Very well, you can go,' repeated Anna Martinovna, 'and put away that wheel, it's lying about.' The peasant ran to carry out her command, while she remained standing a few minutes longer on the steps, still gazing in the direction of the copse. Then she clenched one fist menacingly, and went slowly back into the house. 'Aksyutka!' I heard her imperious voice calling within. Anna Martinovna looked angry, and tightening her lips, thin enough at all times, with a sort of special energy. She was carelessly dressed, and a coil of loose hair had fallen down onto her shoulder. But in spite of the negligence of her attire, and her irritable humour, she struck me, just as before, as attractive, and I should have been delighted to kiss the narrow hand, which looked malignant too, as she twice irritably pushed back the loose tress. Part 21. Can Martin Petrovitch have really taken to fishing? I asked myself as I turned towards the pond, which was on one side of the garden. I got on to the dam, looked in all directions. Martin Petrovitch was nowhere to be seen. I bent my steps along one of the banks of the pond, and at last, at the very top of it, in a little creek, in the midst of flat broken down stalks of reddish reed, I caught sight of a huge greyish mass. I looked intently. It was Harlov. Bareheaded, unkempt, in a cotton smock torn at the seams, with his legs crossed under him, he was sitting motionless on the bare earth. So motionless was he that a sandpiper, at my approach, darted up from the dry mud a couple of paces from him, and flew with a flash of its little wings and a whistle over the surface of the water, showing that no one had moved to frighten him for a long while. Harlov's whole appearance was so extraordinary that my dog stopped short directly it saw him, lifted its tail, and growled. He turned his head a very little, and fixed his wild looking eyes on me and my dog. He was greatly changed by his beard, though it was short, but thick and curly, in white tufts, like Astrachan fur. In his right hand lay the end of a rod, while the other end hovered feebly over the water. I felt an involuntary pang at my heart. I plucked up my spirits, however, went up to him, and wished him good morning. He slowly blinked as though just awake. 'What are you doing, Martin Petrovitch?' I began. 'Catching fish here?' 'Yes, fish,' he answered huskily, and pulled up the rod, on which there fluttered a piece of line, a fathom length, with no hook on it. 'Your tackle is broken off,' I observed, and noticed the same moment that there was no sign of bait tin nor worms near Martin Petrovitch. 'And what sort of fishing could there be in September?' 'Broken off?' he said, and he passed his hand over his face. 'But it's all the same.' He dropped the rod in again. 'Natalia Nikolaevna's son?' he asked me after the lapse of 2 minutes, during which I had been gazing at him with secret bewilderment. Though he had grown terribly thinner, Still he seemed a giant. But what rags he was dressed in, and how utterly he had gone to pieces altogether! "Yes," I answered, "I'm the son of Natalia Nikolaevna B." "Is she well?" "My mother is quite well. She was very much hurt at your refusal," I added. "She did not at all expect you would not wish to come and see her." Martin Petrovitch's head sank on his breast. "Have you been there?" he asked, with a motion of his head. "Where?" "There, at the house. Haven't you? Go! What is there for you to do here? Go! It's useless talking to me. I don't like it." He was silent for a while. "You'd like to be always idling about with a gun. In my young days I used to be inclined the same way too. Only my father was strict, and made me respect him too. Mind you, very different from fathers nowadays. My father flogged me with a horsewhip, and that was the end of it. I'd to give up idling about. And so I respected him. Oh, yes!" Harlov paused again. "Don't you stop here," he began again. "You go along to the house. Things are managed there now. It's first rate. Volodka," here he faltered for a second, "our Volodka's a good hand at everything. He's a fine fellow, yes indeed, and a fine scoundrel too." I did not know what to say. Martin Petrovitch spoke very tranquilly. "And you go and see my daughters. You remember, I dare say, I had daughters. They're managers too, clever ones. But I'm growing old, my lad. I'm on the shelf. Time to repose, you know." Nice sort of repose, I thought, glancing round. "Martin Petrovitch," I uttered aloud, "you really must come and see us." Harlov looked at me. "Go along, my lad, I tell you." "Don't hurt mamma's feelings. Come and see us." "Go away, my lad, go away," persisted Harlov. "What do you want to talk to me for?" "If you have no carriage, mamma will send you hers." "Go along." "But really and truly, Martin Petrovitch." Harlov looked down again, and I fancied that his cheeks, dingy as though covered with earth, faintly flushed. "Really, do come," I went on. "What's the use of your sitting here, of your making yourself miserable?" "Making myself miserable?" he commented hesitatingly. "Yes, to be sure, making yourself miserable," I repeated. Harlov said nothing, and seemed lost in musing. Emboldened by his silence, I determined to be open, to act straightforwardly, bluntly. Do not forget I was only 15 then. "Martin Petrovitch," I began, seating myself beside him, "I know everything, you see, positively everything. I know how your son-in-law is treating you, doubtless with the consent of your daughters. And now you are in such a position. But why lose heart?" Harlov still remained silent, and simply dropped in his line. While what a sensible fellow, what a sage I felt! "Doubtless," I began again, "you acted imprudently in giving up everything to your daughters. It was most generous on your part, and I am not going to blame you. In our days it is a quality only too rare. But since your daughters are so ungrateful, you ought to show a contempt, yes, a contempt for them, and not fret." "Stop!" muttered Harlov, suddenly, gnashing his teeth, and his eyes, staring at the pond, glittered wrathfully. "Go away!" "But, Martin Petrovitch—" "Go away, I tell you, or I'll kill you!" I had come quite close to him, but at the last words I instinctively jumped up. "What did you say, Martin Petrovitch?" "I'll kill you, I tell you! Go away!" With a wild moan, a roar, the words broke from Harlov's breast, but he did not turn his head, and still stared wrathfully straight in front of him. "I'll take you and fling you and your fool's counsel into the water. You shall learn to pester the old, little milksop." "He's gone mad," flashed through my mind. I looked at him more attentively, and was completely petrified. Martin Petrovitch was weeping. Tear after tear rolled from his eyelashes down his cheeks, while his face had assumed an expression utterly savage. "Go away," he roared once more, "or I'll kill you, by God, for an example to others." He was shaking all over from side to side, and showing his teeth like a wild boar. I snatched up my gun and took to my heels. My dog flew after me, barking. He too was frightened. When I got home, I naturally did not, by so much as a word, to my mother, hint at what I had seen, but coming across Souvenir, I told him, the devil knows why, all about it. That loathsome person was so delighted at my story, shrieking with laughter, and even dancing with pleasure, that I could hardly forbear striking him. "Ah, I should like," he kept repeating breathless with laughter, "to see that fiend, the Swede, Harlov, crawling into the mud and sitting in it." "Go over to the pond if you're so curious." "Yes, but how if he kills me?" I felt horribly sick at Souvenir, and regretted my ill-timed confidence. Zhitkov, to whom he repeated my tale, looked at the matter somewhat differently. "We shall have to call in the police," he concluded, "or, may be, we may have to send for a battalion of military." His forebodings with regard to the military battalion did not come true. But something extraordinary really did happen. Section 8 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lear of the Steppes, Part 22. In the middle of October, 3 weeks after my interview with Martin Petrovitch, I was standing at the window of my own room in the second story of our house, and thinking of nothing at all. I looked disconsolately into the yard, and the road that lay beyond it. The weather had been disgusting for the last 5 days. Shooting was not even to be thought of. All things living had hidden themselves, even the sparrows made no sound, and the rooks had long ago disappeared from sight. The wind howled drearily, then whistled spasmodically. The low-hanging sky, unbroken by one streak of light, had changed from an unpleasant whitish to a leaden and still more sinister hue. And the rain, which had been pouring and pouring, mercilessly and unceasingly, had suddenly become still more violent and more driving, and streamed with a rushing sound over the panes. The trees had been stripped utterly bare, and turned a sort of grey. It seemed they had nothing left to plunder, yet the wind would not be denied, but set to harassing them once more. Puddles clogged with dead leaves stood everywhere. Big bubbles, continually bursting and rising up again, leaped and glided over them. Along the roads the mud lay thick and impassable. The cold pierced its way indoors through one's clothes to the very bones. An involuntary shiver passed over the body, and how sick one felt at heart! Sick, precisely, not sad. It seemed there would never again in the world be sunshine, nor brightness, nor colour, but this rain and mire and grey damp and raw fog would last for ever, and for ever would the wind whine and moan. Well, I was standing moodily at my window, and I remember a sudden darkness came on, a bluish darkness, though the clock only pointed to 12. Suddenly I fancied I saw a bear dash across our yard from the gates to the steps, not on all fours certainly, but as he is depicted when he gets up on his hind paws. I could not believe my eyes. If it were not a bear I had seen, it was, anyway, something enormous, black, shaggy. I was still lost in wonder as to what it could be, when suddenly I heard below a furious knocking. It seemed something utterly unlooked for, something terrible, was stumbling headlong into our house. Then began a commotion, a hurrying to and fro. I quickly went down the stairs, ran into the dining room. At the drawing room door, facing me, stood my mother, as though rooted to the spot. Behind her peered several scared female faces. The butler, 2 footmen, and a page, with his mouth wide open with astonishment, were packed together in the doorway of the hall. In the middle of the dining room, covered with mire, dishevelled, tattered, and soaking wet, so wet that steam rose all round and water was running in little streams over the floor, knelt, shaking ponderously, as it were, at the last gasp, the very monster I had seen dashing across the yard. And who was this monster? Harlov. I came up on one side and saw, not his face, but his head, which he was clutching, with both hands in the hair that blinded him with filth. He was breathing heavily, brokenly. Something positively rattled in his throat. And in all the bespattered dark mass, the only thing that could be clearly distinguished was the tiny whites of the eyes, straying wildly about. He was awful. The dignitary came into my mind whom he had once crushed for comparing him to a mastodon. Truly, so might have looked some antediluvian creature that had just escaped another more powerful monster, attacking it in the eternal slime of the primeval swamps. "Martin Petrovitch!" my mother cried at last, and she clasped her hands. "Is that you? Good God! Merciful heavens!" I we heard a broken voice, which seemed with effort and painfully to dwell on each sound. "Alas, it is I." "But what has happened to you? Mercy upon us!" "Natalia Nikolaevna, I have run straight to you from home on foot." "Through such mud! But you don't look like a man. Get up, sit down, anyway. And you," she turned to the maid servants, "run quick for cloths. And haven't you some dry clothes?" she asked the butler. The butler gesticulated as though to say, "Is it likely for such a size?" "But we could get a coverlet," he replied. "Or there's a new horse rug." "But get up, Martin Petrovitch, sit down," repeated my mother. "They've turned me out, madame," Harlov moaned suddenly, and he flung his head back and stretched his hands out before him. "They've turned me out, Natalia Nikolaevna, my own daughters, out of my own home." My mother sighed and groaned. "What are you saying? Turned you out? What wickedness! What wickedness!" She crossed herself. "But do get up, Martin Petrovitch, I beg you." Two maidservants came in with cloths and stood before Harlov. It was clear they did not know how to attack this mountain of filth. "They have turned me out, madame, they have turned me out," Harlov kept repeating meanwhile. The butler returned with a large woolen coverlet, and he, too, stood still in perplexity. Souvenir's little head was thrust in at a door and vanished again. "Martin Petrovitch, get up, sit down, and tell me everything properly," my mother commanded in a tone of determination. Harlov rose. The butler tried to assist him, but only dirtied his hand, and, shaking his fingers, retreated to the door. Staggering and faltering, Harlov got to a chair and sat down. The maids again approached him with their cloths, but he waved them off with his hand, and refused the coverlet. My mother did not herself, indeed, insist. To dry Harlov was obviously out of the question. They contented themselves with hastily wiping up his traces on the floor. Part 23. "How have they turned you out?" my mother asked, as soon as he had a little time to recover himself. "Madame, Natalia Nikolaevna," he began in a strained voice, and again I was struck by the uneasy straying of his eyes. "I will tell you the truth. I am myself most of all to blame." "Ay, to be sure. You would not listen to me at the time," assented my mother, sinking into an armchair and slightly moving a scented handkerchief before her nose. Very strong was the smell that came from Harlov. The odour in a forest bog is not so strong. "Alas, that's not where I erred, madam, but through pride. Pride has been my ruin, as it ruined the Tsar Navuhodonosor. I fancied God had given me my full share of sense, and if I resolved on anything, it followed it was right. So and then the fear of death came. I was utterly confounded. 'I'll show,' said I, 'to the last, my power and my strength. I'll bestow all on them, and they must feel it all their lives.' Harlov suddenly was shaking all over. 'Like a mangy dog they have driven me out of the house. This is their gratitude.' 'In what way?' my mother was beginning. 'They took my page, Maximka, from me.' Harlov interrupted her. His eyes were still wandering, he held both hands, the fingers interlaced, under his chin. 'My carriage they took away, my monthly allowance they cut down. Did not pay me the sum specified, cut me short all round in fact. Still I said nothing, bore it all, and I bore it by reason, alas! of my pride again, that my cruel enemies might not say, "See, the old fool's sorry for it now." And you too, do you remember, madam, had warned me, "Mind you, it's all to no purpose." You said, and so I bore it. Only to day I came into my room, and it was occupied already, and my bed they'd thrown out into the lumber room. You can sleep there, we put up with you there even only out of charity. We've need of your room for the household. And this was said to me by whom? Volodka Sletkin, the vile hound, base cur!' Harlov's voice broke. 'But your daughters, what did they do?' asked my mother. 'But I bore it all,' Harlov went on again. 'Bitterness, bitterness was in my heart, let me tell you, and shame. I could not bear to look upon the light of day. That was why I was unwilling to come and see you, ma'am, from this same feeling, from shame for my disgrace. I have tried everything, my good friend, kindness, affection, and threats, and I reasoned with them, and more besides. I bowed down before them, like this.' Harlov showed how he had bowed down. 'And all in vain. And all of it I bore. At the beginning, at first, I'd very different thoughts. I'll up, I thought, and kill them, I'll crush them all, so that not a trace remains of them. I'll let them know. Well, but after I submitted. It's a cross, I thought, laid upon me. It's to bid me make ready for death. And all at once, to day, driven out, like a cur. And by whom? Volodka. And you asked about my daughters? They've no will of their own at all. They're Volodka's slaves. Yes.' My mother wondered. 'In Anna's case I can understand that. She's a wife. But how comes it you're second?' 'Evlampia? She's worse than Anna. She's altogether given herself up into Volodka's hands. That's the reason she refused your soldier too. At Volodka's bidding. Anna, to be sure, ought to resent it, and she can't bear her sister, but she submits. He's bewitched them, the cursed scoundrel. Though she, Anna, I dare say, is pleased to think that Evlampia, who was always so proud, and now see what she's come to. Oh, alas, alas! God, oh my God!' My mother looked uneasily towards me. I moved a little away as a precautionary measure, for fear I should be sent away altogether. 'I am very sorry indeed, Martin Petrovitch,' she began, 'that my former protégé has caused you so much sorrow, and has turned out so badly. But I too was mistaken in him. Who could have expected this of him?' 'Madam,' Harlov moaned out, and he struck himself a blow on the chest, 'I cannot bear the ingratitude of my daughters. I cannot, madam. You know I gave them everything, everything. And besides, my conscience has been tormenting me. Many things, alas, many things I have thought over, sitting by the pond, fishing. If you'd only done good to any one in your life, was what I pondered upon. Succoured the poor, set the peasants free, or something, to atone for having wrung their lives out of them. You must answer for them before God. Now their tears are revenged. And what sort of life have they now? It was a deep pit even in my time, why disguise my sins? But now there's no seeing the bottom. All these sins I have taken upon my soul. I have sacrificed my conscience for my children, and for this I'm laughed to scorn, kicked out of the house like a cur." "Don't think about that, Martin Petrovitch," observed my mother. "And when he told me, your Volodka," Harlov went on with fresh force, "when he told me I was not to live in my room any more, I laid every plank in that room with my own hands. When he said that to me, God only knows what passed within me. It was all confusion in my head, and like a knife in my heart. Either to cut his throat, or to get away out of the house. So I have run to you, my benefactress, Natalia Nikolaevna. Where had I to lay my head? And then the rain, the filth. I fell down 20 times maybe. And now, in such unseemly—" Harlov scanned himself and moved restlessly in his chair, as though intending to get up. "Say no more, Martin Petrovitch," my mother interposed hurriedly. "What does that signify? That you've made the floor dirty? That's no great matter. Come, I want to make you a proposition. Listen. They shall take you now to a special room and make you up a clean bed. You undress, wash, and lie down and sleep a little." "Natalia Nikolaevna, there's no sleeping for me," Harlov responded drearily. "It's as though there were hammers beating in my brain. Me, like some good-for-nothing beast." "Lie down and sleep," my mother repeated insistently, "and then we'll give you some tea, yes, and we'll have a talk. Don't lose heart, old friend. If they've driven you out of your house, in my house you'll always find a home. I have not forgotten, you know, that you saved my life." "Benefactress," moaned Harlov, and he covered his face with his hand. "You must save me now." This appeal touched my mother almost to tears. "I am ready and eager to help you, Martin Petrovitch, in everything I am able. But you must promise me that you will listen to me in future and dismiss every evil thought from you." Harlov took his hands from his face. "If need be," he said, "I can forgive them, even." My mother nodded her head approvingly. "I am very glad to see you in such a truly Christian frame of mind, Martin Petrovitch. But we will talk of that later. Meanwhile, you put yourself to rights, and, most of all, sleep. Take Martin Petrovitch to what was the master's room, the green room," said my mother, addressing the butler. "And whatever he asks for, let him have it on the spot. Give orders for his clothes to be dried and washed, and ask the housekeeper for what linen is needed. Do you hear?" "Yes, madam," replied the butler. "And as soon as he's asleep, tell the tailor to take his measure, and his beard will have to be shaved. Not at once, but after." "Yes, madam," repeated the butler. "Martin Petrovitch, kindly come." Harlov got up, looked at my mother, was about to go up to her, but stopped, swinging a bough from the waist, crossed himself 3 times to the image, and followed the steward. Behind him, I too slipped out of the room. Part 24. The butler conducted Harlov to the green room, and at once ran off to the wardroom maid, as it turned out there were no sheets on the bed. Souvenir, who met us in the passage, popped into the green room with us, promptly proceeded to dance, grinning and chuckling, round Harlov, who stood, his arms held a little away from him, and his legs apart, in the middle of the room, seemingly lost in thought. The water was still dripping from him. The Swede, Harlus," piped Souvenir, doubling up and holding his sides. "Mighty founder of the illustrious race of Harlovs, look down on thy descendant. What does he look like? Dost thou recognize him? Ha ha ha! Your Excellency, your hand, I beg. Why, have you got on black gloves?" I tried to restrain Souvenir, to put him to shame, but it was too late for that now. "He called me parasite, toady, you've no roof, said he, to call your own. But now, no doubt about it, he's become as dependent as poor little me. Martin Petrovitch and Souvenir, the poor toady, are equal now. He'll have to live on charity, too. They'll toss him the stale and dirty crust that the dog has sniffed at and refused, and they'll tell him to eat it, too. Ha ha ha!" Harlov still stood motionless, his head drawn in, his legs and arms held a little apart. "Martin Harlov, a nobleman born!" Souvenir went on shrieking. "What airs he used to give himself! Just look at me! Don't come near, or I'll knock you down! And when he was so clever as to give away and divide his property, didn't he crow? Gratitude!" he cackled. "Gratitude! But why were you so mean to me? Why didn't you make me a present? Maybe I should have felt it more, and you see I was right when I said they'd strip you bare, and—" "Souvenir!" I screamed, but Souvenir was in no wise daunted. Harlov still did not stir. It seemed as though he were only now beginning to be aware how soaking wet everything was that he had on, and was waiting to be helped off with his clothes. But the butler had not come back. "And a military man, too," Souvenir began again. "In the year 12 he saved his country. He showed proofs of his valour. I see how it is. Stripping the frozen marauders of their breeches is work he's quite equal to, but when the hussies stamp their feet at him, he's frightened out of his skin." "Souvenir!" I screamed a second time. Harlov looked askance at Souvenir. Till that instant he seemed not to have noticed his presence, and only my exclamation aroused his attention. "Look out, brother," he growled huskily. "Don't dance yourself into trouble." Souvenir fairly rolled about with laughter. "Ah, how you frighten me, most honoured brother! You're a formidable person, to be sure. You must comb your hair at any rate, or, God forbid, it'll get dry, and you'll never wash it clean again. You'll have to mow it with a sickle." Souvenir all of a sudden got into a fury. "And you give yourself airs still. A poor outcast, and he gives himself airs. Where's your home now? You'd better tell me that, you were always boasting of it. 'I have a home of my own,' he used to say. But you're homeless. 'My ancestral roof,' he would say." Souvenir pounced on this phrase as an inspiration. "Mr. Bitchkov," I protested, "what are you about? You forget yourself." But he still persisted in chattering, and still danced and pranced up and down quite close to Harlov. And still the butler and the wardroom maid did not come. I felt alarmed. I began to notice that Harlov, who had, during his conversation with my mother, gradually grown quieter, and even towards the end apparently resigned himself to his fate, was beginning to get worked up again. He breathed more hurriedly, it seemed as though his face was suddenly swollen under his ears, his fingers twitched, his eyes again began moving restlessly in the dark mask of his grim face. "Souvenir! Souvenir!" I cried. "Stop it! I'll tell mamma!" But Souvenir seemed possessed by frenzy. "Yes, yes, most honoured brother," he began again. "Here we find ourselves, you and I, in the most delicate position. While your daughters, with your son-in-law, Vladimir Vassilievitch, are having a fine laugh at you under your roof. And you should at least curse them, as you promised, even that you're not equal to. To be sure, how could you hold your own with Vladimir Vassilievitch? Why, you used to call him Volodka too. You called him Volodka. He is Vladimir Vassilievitch, Mr. Sletkin, a landowner, a gentleman, while what are you, pray?" A furious roar drowned Souvenir's words. Harlov was aroused. His fists were clenched and lifted, his face was purple, there was foam on his drawn lips, he was shaking with rage. "Roof, you say," he thundered in his iron voice. "Curse, you say. No, I will not curse them, they don't care for that. But the roof! I will tear the roof off them, and they shall have no roof over their heads, like me. They shall learn to know Martin Harlov. My strength is not all gone yet. They shall learn to laugh at me. They shall have no roof over their heads." I was stupefied. Never in my life had I witnessed such boundless anger. Not a man, a wild beast, paced to and fro before me. I was stupefied. As for Souvenir, he had hidden under the table in his fright. "They shall not!" Harlov shouted for the last time, and almost knocking over the butler and the wardroom maid, he rushed away out of the house. He dashed headlong across the yard and vanished through the gates. Section 9 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This recording is in the public domain. A Lear of the Steppes, Part 25. My mother was terribly angry when the butler came with an abashed countenance to report Martin Petrovitch's sudden and unexpected retreat. He did not dare to conceal the cause of this retreat. I was obliged to confirm his story. "Then it was all your doing!" my mother cried, at the sight of Souvenir, who had run in like a hare, and was even approaching to kiss her hand. "Your vile tongue is to blame for it all." "Excuse me, directly," faltered Souvenir, stuttering and drawing back his elbows behind him. Directly, I know you're directly," my mother repeated reprovingly, as she sent him out of the room. Then she rang the bell, sent for Kvitsinsky, and gave him orders to set off on the spot to Eskovo with a carriage, to find Martin Petrovitch at all costs, and to bring him back. "Do not let me see you without him," she concluded. The gloomy Pole bowed his head without a word, and went away. I went back to my own room, sat down again at the window, and I pondered a long while, I remember, on what had taken place before my eyes. I was puzzled. I could not understand how it was that Harlov, who had endured the insults of his own family almost without a murmur, had lost all self-control and been unable to put up with the jeers and pinpricks of such an abject creature as Souvenir. I did not understand in those days what insufferable bitterness there may sometimes be in a foolish taunt, even when it comes from lips one scorns. The hated name of Sletkin, uttered by Souvenir, had been like a spark thrown into powder. The sore spot could not endure this final prick. About an hour passed by. Our coach drove into the yard, but our steward sat in it alone. And my mother had said to him, "Don't let me see you without him." Kvitsinsky jumped hurriedly out of the carriage and ran up the steps. His face had a perturbed look, something very unusual with him. I promptly rushed downstairs, and followed at his heels into the drawing room. "Well, have you brought him?" asked my mother. "I have not brought him," answered Kvitsinsky, "and I could not bring him." "How's that? Have you seen him?" "Yes." "What has happened to him? A fit?" "No, nothing has happened." "How is it you didn't bring him?" "He's pulling his house to pieces." "What?" "He's standing on the roof of the new building and pulling it to pieces. 40 boards or more, I should guess, must have come down by now, and some 5 of the rafters too." "They shall not have a roof over their heads," Harlov's words came back to me. My mother stared at Kvitsinsky. "Alone, he's standing on the roof, and pulling the roof down?" "Exactly so. He is walking about on the flooring of the garret in the roof, and smashing right and left of him. His strength, you are aware, madam, is superhuman. And the roof too, one must say, is a poor affair. Half-inch deal battens, laid wide apart, 1-inch nails." My mother looked at me, as though wishing to make sure she had heard aright. "Half inches wide apart?" she repeated, obviously not understanding the meaning of one word. "Well, what then?" she said at last. "I have come for instructions. There's no doing anything without men to help. The peasants there are limp with fright." "And his daughters, what of them?" "His daughters are doing nothing. They're running to and fro shouting this and that, all to no purpose." "And is Sletkin there?" "He's there too. He's making more outcry than all of them, but he can't do anything. And Martin Petrovitch is standing on the roof? On the roof, that is, in the garret, and pulling the roof to pieces. Yes, yes, said my mother, half inches wide apart. The position was obviously a serious one. What steps were to be taken? Send to the town for the police captain? Get together the peasants? My mother was quite at her wits' end. Zhitkov, who had come in to dinner, was nonplussed too. It is true, he made another reference to a battalion of military. He offered no advice, however, but confined himself to looking submissive and devoted. Kvitsinsky, seeing he would not get at any instructions, suggested to my mother, with the contemptuous respectfulness peculiar to him, that if she would authorize him to take a few of the stable boys, gardeners, and other house serfs, he would make an effort. Yes, yes, my mother cut him short, do make an effort, dear Vikenty Osipitch. Only make haste, please, and I will take all responsibility on myself. Kvitsinsky smiled coldly. One thing let me make clear, madam, beforehand. It's impossible to reckon on any result, seeing that Mr. Harlov's strength is so great, and he is so desperate too. He feels himself to have been very cruelly wronged. Yes, yes, my mother assented, and it's all that vile Souvenir's fault. Never will I forgive him for it. Go and take the servants and set off, Vikenty Osipitch. You'd better take plenty of cord, Mr. Steward, and some fire escape tackle, Zhitkov brought out in his bass. And if there is such a thing as a net, it would be as well to take that along too. We once had in our regiment. Kindly refrain from instructing me, sir, Kvitsinsky cut him short, with an air of vexation. I know what is needed without your aid. Zhitkov was offended, and protested that as he imagined he, too, was called upon. No, no, interposed my mother. You'd better stop where you are. Let Vikenty Osipitch act alone. Make haste, Vikenty Osipitch. Zhitkov was still more offended, while Kvitsinsky bowed and went out. I rushed off to the stable, hurriedly saddled my horse myself, and set off at a gallop along the road to Eskovo. Part 26. The rain had ceased, but the wind was blowing with redoubled force, straight into my face. Half-way there the saddle almost slipped round under me, the girth had got loose. I got off and tried to tighten the straps with my teeth. All at once I heard someone calling me by my name. Souvenir was running towards me across the green fields. What? He shouted to me from some way off. Was your curiosity too much for you? But it's no use, I went over there straight, at Harlov's heels. Such a state of things you never saw in your life. You want to enjoy what you have done, I said indignantly, and jumping on my horse, I set off again at a gallop. But the indefatigable Souvenir did not give me up, and chuckled and grinned, even as he ran. At last Eskovo was reached. There was the dam, and there the long hedge and willow tree of the homestead. I rode up to the gate, dismounted, tied up my horse, and stood still in amazement. Of 1/3 of the roof of the newer house, of the front part, nothing was left but the skeleton. Boards and litter lay in disorderly heaps on the ground on both sides of the building. Even supposing the roof to be, as Kvitsinsky had said, a poor affair, even so, it was something incredible. On the floor of the garret, in a whirl of dust and rubbish, a blackish-grey mass was moving to and fro with rapid ungainly action, at one moment shaking the remaining chimney, built of brick (the other had fallen already), then tearing up the boarding and flinging it down below, then clutching at the very rafters. It was Harlov. He struck me as being exactly like a bear at this moment too. The head and back and shoulders were a bear's, and he put his feet down wide apart without bending the insteps, also like a bear. The bitter wind was blowing upon him from every side, lifting his matted locks. It was horrible to see. Here and there red patches of bare flesh through the rents in his tattered clothes. It was horrible to hear his wild husky muttering. There were a lot of people in the yard. Peasant women, boys, and servant girls stood close along the hedge. A few peasants huddled together in a separate group, a little way off. The old village priest, whom I knew, was standing, bareheaded, on the steps of the other house, and holding a brazen cross in both hands, from time to time, silently and hopelessly, raised it, and, as it were, showed it to Harlov. Beside the priest stood Evlampia, with her back against the wall, gazing fixedly at her father. Anna, at one moment, pushed her head out of the little window, then vanished, then hurried into the yard, then went back into the house. Sletkin, pale all over, livid, in an old dressing gown and smoking cap, with a single-barrelled rifle in his hands, kept running to and fro with little steps. He had completely gone Jewish, as it is called. He was gasping, threatening, shaking, pointing the gun at Harlov, then letting it drop back on his shoulder, pointing it again, shrieking, weeping. On seeing Souvenir and me, he simply flew to us. "Look, look what is going on here," he wailed. "Look, he's gone out of his mind, he's raving mad, and see what he's doing. I've sent for the police already, but no one comes, no one comes. If I do fire at him, the law couldn't touch me, for every man has a right to defend his own property. And I will fire, by God, I'll fire!" He ran off toward the house. "Martin Petrovitch, look out! If you don't get down, I'll fire!" "Fire away!" came a husky voice from the roof. "Fire away! And meanwhile, here's a little present for you." A long plank flew up, and turning over twice in the air, came violently down to the earth, just at Sletkin's feet. He positively jumped into the air, while Harlov chuckled. "Merciful Jesus!" faltered someone behind me. I looked round. Souvenir. Ah, I thought, he's left off laughing now. Sletkin clutched a peasant, who was standing near, by the collar. "Climb up now, climb up, all of you, you devils!" he wailed, shaking the man with all his force. "Save my property!" The peasant took a couple of steps forward, threw his head back, waved his arms, shouted, "Hi! Here, master!" shifted from one foot to the other uneasily, and then turned back. "A ladder! Bring a ladder!" Sletkin addressed the other peasants. "Where are we to get it?" was heard in answer. "And if we had a ladder," one voice pronounced deliberately, "who'd care to climb up? Not such fools! He'd wring your neck for you, in a twinkling." "He'd kill one in no time," said one young lad with flaxen hair and a half idiotic face. "To be sure he would," the others confirmed. It struck me that, even if there had been no obvious danger, the peasants would yet have been loath to carry out their new owner's orders. They almost approved of Harlov, though they were amazed at him. "Ugh, you robbers!" moaned Sletkin. "You shall all catch it!" But at this moment, with a heavy rumble, the last chimney came crashing down, and, in the midst of the cloud of yellow dust that flew up instantly, Harlov, uttering a piercing shriek, and lifting his bleeding hands high in the air, turned facing us. Sletkin pointed the gun at him again. Evlampia pulled him back by the elbow. "Don't interfere!" he snarled savagely at her. "And you, don't you dare!" she answered, and her blue eyes flashed menacingly under her scowling brows. "Father's pulling his house down. It's his own." "You lie, it's ours." "You say ours, but I say it's his." Sletkin hissed with fury. Evlampia's eyes seemed stabbing him in the face. "Ah, how d'ye do, my delightful daughter?" Harlov thundered from above. "How d'ye do, Evlampia Martinovna? How are you getting on with your sweetheart? Are your kisses sweet, and your fondling?" "Father!" rang out Evlampia's musical voice. "Eh, daughter?" answered Harlov, and he came down to the very edge of the wall. His face, as far as I could make it out, wore a strange smile, a bright, mirthful, and for that very reason peculiarly strange and evil, smile. Many years later I saw just the same smile on the face of a man condemned to death. Stop, father, come down! We are in fault. We give everything back to you. Come down!" "What do you mean by disposing of what's ours?" put in Sletkin. Evlampia merely scowled more angrily. "I give you back my share. I give up everything. Give over. Come down, father. Forgive us. Forgive me." Harlov still went on smiling. "It's too late, my darling," he said, and each of his words rang out like brass. "Too late your stony heart is touched. The rock's started rolling downhill, there's no holding it back now. And don't look to me now, I'm a doomed man. You'd do better to look to your Volodka, see what a pretty fellow you've picked out. And look to your hellish sister, there's her foxy nose yonder thrust out of the window. She's peering yonder after that husband of hers. No, my good friends, you would rob me of a roof over my head, so I will leave you not one beam upon another. With my own hands I built it, with my own hands I destroy it. Yes, with my hands alone. See, I've taken no axe to help me." He snorted at his two open hands, and clutched at the centre beam again. "Enough, father," Evlampia was saying meanwhile, and her voice had grown marvellously caressing. "Let bygones be bygones. Come, trust me. You always trusted me. Come, get down, come to me to my little room, to my soft bed. I will dry you and warm you. I will bind up your wounds. See, you have torn your hands. You shall live with me as in Christ's bosom. Food shall be sweet to you, and sleep sweeter yet. Come, we have done wrong. Yes, we were puffed up. We have sinned. Come, forgive." Harlov shook his head. "Talk away. Me believe you? Never again. You've murdered all trust in my heart. You've murdered everything. I was an eagle, and became a worm for you. And you, would you even crush the worm? Have done. I loved you, you know very well. But now you are no daughter to me, and I'm no father to you. I'm a doomed man. Don't meddle. As for you, fire away, coward, mighty man of valour!" Harlov bellowed suddenly at Sletkin. "Why is it you keep aiming and don't shoot? Are you mindful of the law? If the recipient of a gift commits an attempt upon the life of the giver," Harlov enunciated distinctly, "then the giver is empowered to claim everything back again? Ha ha! Don't be afraid, law-abiding man. I'd make no claims. I'll make an end of everything myself. Here goes!" "Father!" for the last time Evlampia besought him. "Silence!" "Martin Petrovitch, brother, be generous and forgive," faltered Souvenir. "Father, dear father!" "Silence, bitch!" shouted Harlov. At Souvenir he did not even glance; he merely spat in his direction. Part 27. At that instant Kvitsinsky with all his retinue, in 3 carts, appeared at the gates. The tired horses panted, the men jumped out, one after another, into the mud. "Aha!" Harlov shouted at the top of his voice. "An army! Here it comes, an army! A whole army they're sending against me! Capital! Only I give warning, if any one comes up here to me on the roof, I'll send him flying down, head over heels. I'm an inhospitable master. I don't like visitors at wrong times. No, indeed!" He was hanging with both hands onto the front rafters of the roof, the so-called standards of the gable, and beginning to shake them violently. Balancing on the edge of the garret flooring, he dragged them, as it were, after him, chanting rhythmically like a bargeman, "One more pull! One more, oh!" Sletkin ran up to Kvitsinsky, and was beginning to whimper and pour out complaints. The latter begged him not to interfere, and proceeded to carry out the plan he had evolved. He took up his position in front of the house, and began, by way of diversion, to explain to Harlov that what he was about was unworthy of his rank. "One more pull, one more," chanted Harlov. That Natalia Nikolaevna was greatly displeased at his proceedings, and had not expected it of him. "One more pull, "One more, oh!" Harlov chanted, while, meantime, Kvitsinsky had dispatched the 4 sturdiest and boldest of the stable boys to the other side of the house to clamber up the roof from behind. Harlov, however, detected the plan of attack. He suddenly left the standards and ran quickly to the back part of the roof. His appearance was so alarming that the 2 stable boys, who had already got up to the garret, dropped instantly back again to the ground by the water pipe, to the great glee of the serf boys, who positively roared with laughter. Harlov shook his fist after them and, going back to the front part of the house, again clutched at the standards and began once more loosening them, singing again like a bargeman. Suddenly he stopped, stared. "Maximushka, my dear, my friend," he cried, "is it you?" I looked round. There actually was Maximka, stepping out from the crowd of peasants. Grinning and showing his teeth, he walked forward. His master, the tailor, had probably let him come home for a holiday. "Climb up to me, Maximushka, my faithful servant," Harlov went on. "Together let us rid ourselves of evil Tartar folk, of Lithuanian thieves." Maximka, still grinning, promptly began climbing up the roof. But they seized him and pulled him back, goodness knows why. Possibly as an example to the rest. He could hardly have been much aid to Martin Petrovitch. "Oh, all right, good," Harlov pronounced, in a voice of menace. And again he took hold of the standards. "Vikenty Osipovitch, with your permission, I'll shoot." Sletkin turned to Kvitsinsky. "More to frighten him, see, than anything. My gun's only charged with snipe shot." But Kvitsinsky had not time to answer him, when the front couple of standards, viciously shaken in Harlov's iron hands, heeled over with a loud crack and crashed into the yard; and with it, not able to stop himself, came Harlov too, and fell with a heavy thud on the earth. Every one shuddered and drew a deep breath. Harlov lay without stirring on his breast, and on his back lay the top central beam of the roof, which had come down with the falling gable's timbers. Section 10 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lear of the Steppes, Part 28. They ran up to Harlov, rolled the beam off him, turned him over on his back. His face was lifeless, there was blood about his mouth, he did not seem to breathe. "The breath has gone out of him," muttered the peasants, standing about him. They ran to the well for water, brought a whole bucketful, and drenched Harlov's head. The mud and dust ran off his face, but he looked as lifeless as ever. They dragged up a bench, set it in the house itself, and with difficulty raising the huge body of Martin Petrovitch, laid it there with the head to the wall. The page Maximka approached, fell on one knee, and, his other leg stretched far behind him, in a theatrical way supported his former master's arm. Evlampia, pale as death, stood directly facing her father, her great eyes fastened immovably upon him. Anna and Sletkin did not come near him. All were silent, all, as it were, waiting for something. At last we heard broken, smacking noises in Harlov's throat, as though he were swallowing. Then he feebly moved one, his right, hand (Maximka supported the left), opened one, the right eye, and slowly gazing about him, as though drunken with some fearful drunkenness, groaned, articulated, stammering, "I'm smashed," as though after a moment's thought added, "Here it is, the raven colt." The blood suddenly gushed thickly from his mouth, his whole body began to quiver. The end, I thought. But once more Harlov opened the same eye, the left eyelid lay as motionless as on a dead man's face, and fixing it on Evlampia, he articulated, hardly above a breath, "Well, daughter, you I do not—' Kvitsinsky, with a sharp motion of his hand, beckoned to the priest, who was still standing on the step. The old man came up, his narrow cassock clinging about his feeble knees. But suddenly there was a sort of horrible twitching in Harlov's legs, and in his stomach too. An irregular contraction passed upwards over his face. Evlampia's face seemed quivering and working in the same way. Maximka began crossing himself. I was seized with horror. I ran out to the gates, squeezed myself close to them, not looking round. A minute later a soft murmur ran through the crowd, behind my back, and I understood that Martin Petrovitch was no more. His skull had been fractured by the beam, and his ribs injured, as it appeared at the post mortem examination. Part 29. What had he wanted to say to her as he lay dying? I asked myself as I went home on my cob, I do not forgive, or do not pardon. The rain had come on again, but I rode at a walking pace. I wanted to be alone as long as possible. I wanted to give myself up to my reflections, unchecked. Souvenir had gone back in one of the carts that had come with Kvitsinsky. Young and frivolous as I was at that time, the sudden sweeping change, not in mere details only, that is invariably called forth in all hearts by the coming of death, expected or unexpected, it makes no difference, its majesty, its gravity, and its truthfulness could not fail to impress me. I was impressed too, but for all that my troubled, childish eyes noted many things at once. They noted how Sletkin, hurriedly and furtively, as though it were something stolen, popped the gun out of sight; how he and his wife became, both of them, instantly the object of a sort of unspoken but universal aloofness. To Evlampia, though her fault was probably no less than her sister's, this aloofness did not extend. She even aroused a certain sympathy, when she fell at her dead father's feet. But that she too was guilty, that was none the less felt by all. 'The old man was wronged,' said a grey-haired peasant with a big head, leaning, like some ancient judge, with both hands and his beard on a long staff. 'On your soul lies the sin. You wronged him.' That saying was at once accepted by every one as the final judgment. The peasant's sense of justice found expression in it, I felt that at once. I noticed too that, at the first, Sletkin did not dare to give directions. Without him, they lifted up the body and carried it into the other house. Without asking him, the priest went for everything needful to the church, while the village elder ran to the village to send off a cart and horse to the town. Even Anna Martinovna did not venture to use her ordinary imperious tone in ordering the samovar to be brought. 'For hot water, to wash the deceased.' Her orders were more like an entreaty, and she was answered rudely. I was absorbed all the while by the question, what was it exactly he wanted to say to his daughter? Did he want to forgive her or to curse her? Finally, I decided that it was forgiveness. 3 days later, the funeral of Martin Petrovitch took place. The cost of the ceremony was undertaken by my mother, who was deeply grieved at his death, and gave orders that no expense was to be spared. She did not herself go to the church, because she was unwilling, as she said, to set eyes on those two vile hussies and that nasty little Jew. But she sent Kvitsinsky, me, and Zhitkov, though from that time forward she always spoke of the latter as a regular old woman. Souvenir she did not admit to her presence, and was furious with him for long after, saying that he was the murderer of her friend. He felt his disgrace acutely; he was continually running, on tiptoe, up and down the room, next to the one where my mother was. He gave himself up to a sort of scared and abject melancholy, shuddering and muttering, 'Directly.' In church and during the procession, Sletkin struck me as having recovered his self possession. He gave directions and bustled about in his old way, and kept a greedy look out that not a superfluous farthing should be spent, though his own pocket was not in question. Maximka, in a new Cossack dress, also a present from my mother, gave vent to such tenor notes in the choir, that certainly no one could have any doubts as to the sincerity of his devotion to the deceased. Both the sisters were duly attired in mourning, but they seemed more stupefied than grieved, especially Evlampia. Anna wore a meek Lenten air, but made no attempt to weep, and was continually passing her handsome, thin hand over her hair and cheek. Evlampia seemed deep in thought all the time. The universal, unbending alienation, condemnation, which I had noticed on the day of Harlov's death, I detected now too on the faces of all the people in the church, in their actions and their glances, but still more grave and, as it were, impersonal. It seemed as though all those people felt that the sin into which the Harlov family had fallen, this great sin, had gone now before the presence of the one righteous judge, and that for that reason there was no need now for them to trouble themselves and be indignant. They prayed devoutly for the soul of the dead man, whom in life they had not specially liked, whom they had feared indeed. Very abruptly had death overtaken him. "And it's not as though he had been drinking heavily, brother," said one peasant to another, in the porch. "Nay, without drink he was drunken indeed," responded the other. "He was cruelly wronged," the first peasant repeated the phrase that summed it up. "Cruelly wronged," the others murmured after him. "The deceased was a hard master to you, wasn't he?" I asked a peasant, whom I recognized as one of Harlov's serfs. "He was a master, certainly," answered the peasant, "but still he was cruelly wronged." "Cruelly wronged," I heard again in the crowd. At the grave, too, Evlampia stood, as it were, lost. Thoughts were torturing her, bitter thoughts. I noticed that Sletkin, who several times addressed some remark to her, she treated as she had once treated Zhitkov, and worse still. Some days later there was a rumour all over the neighbourhood that Evlampia Martinovna had left the home of her fathers for ever, leaving all the property that came to her sister and brother-in-law, and only taking some hundreds of roubles. "So Anna's bought her out, it seems," remarked my mother. "But you and I, certainly," she added, addressing Zhitkov, with whom she was playing piquet. He took Souvenir's place. "Are not skilful hands." Zhitkov looked dejectedly at his mighty palms. "Hands like that? Not skilful," he seemed to be saying to himself. Soon after, my mother and I went to live in Moscow, and many years passed before it was my lot to behold Martin Petrovitch's daughters again. Part 30. But I did see them again. Anna Martinovna I came across in the most ordinary way. After my mother's death I paid a visit to our village, where I had not been for over 15 years, and there I received an invitation from the mediator. At that time the process of settling the boundaries between the peasants and their former owners was taking place over the whole of Russia with a slowness not yet forgotten, to a meeting of the other landowners of our neighbourhood, to be held on the estate of the widow Anna Sletkin. The news that my mother's "nasty little Jew," with the prune-coloured eyes, no longer existed in this world, caused me, I confess, no regret whatever. But it was interesting to get a glimpse of his widow. She had the reputation in the neighbourhood of a first-rate manager. And so it proved. Her estate and homestead, and the house itself (I could not help glancing at the roof, it was an iron one), all turned out to be in excellent order. Everything was neat, clean, tidied up, where needful, painted, as though its mistress were a German. Anna Martinovna herself, of course, looked older, but the peculiar, cold, and, as it were, wicked charm which had once so fascinated me had not altogether left her. She was dressed in a rustic fashion, but elegantly. She received us, not cordially, that word was not applicable to her, but courteously, and on seeing me, a witness of that fearful scene, not an eyelash quivered. She made not the slightest reference to my mother, nor her father, nor her sister, nor her husband. She had 2 daughters, both very pretty, slim young things, with charming little faces and a bright and friendly expression in their black eyes. There was a son, too, a little like his father, but still a boy to be proud of. During the discussions between the landowners, Anna Martinovna's attitude was composed and dignified, she showed no sign of being specially obstinate, nor specially grasping. But none had a truer perception of their own interests than she of hers; none could more convincingly expound and defend their rights. All the laws pertinent to the case, even the minister's circulars, she had thoroughly mastered. She spoke little, and in a quiet voice, but every word she uttered was to the point. It ended in all our signifying our agreement to all her demands, and making concessions, which we could only marvel at ourselves. On our way home, some of the worthy landowners even used harsh words of themselves. They all hummed and hawed, and shook their heads. "Ah, she's got brains, that woman," said one. "A tricky baggage," put in another less delicate proprietor, "smooth in word, but cruel in deed." "And a screw into the bargain," added a third. "Not a glass of vodka nor a morsel of caviare for us. What do you think of that?" "What can one expect of her?" suddenly croaked a gentleman who had been silent till then. "Every one knows she poisoned her husband." To my astonishment, nobody thought fit to controvert this awful and certainly unfounded charge. I was the more surprised at this, as, in spite of the slighting expressions I have reported, all of them felt respect for Anna Martinovna, not excluding the indelicate landowner. As for the mediator, he waxed positively eloquent. "Put her on a throne," he exclaimed. "She'd be another Semiramis or Catherine II. The discipline among her peasants is a perfect model. The education of her children is a model. What a head! What brains!" Without going into the question of Semiramis and Catherine, there was no doubt Anna Martinovna was living a very happy life. Ease, inward and external, the pleasant serenity of spiritual health, seemed the very atmosphere about herself, her family, all her surroundings. How far she had deserved such happiness, that is another question. Such questions, though, are only propounded in youth. Everything in the world, good and bad, comes to man, not through his deserts, but in consequence of some as yet unknown but logical laws which I will not take upon myself to indicate, though I sometimes fancy I have a dim perception of them. Part 31. I questioned the mediator about Evlampia Martinovna, and learnt that she had been lost sight of completely ever since she left home, and probably had departed this life long ago. So our worthy mediator expressed himself, but I am convinced that I have seen Evlampia, that I have come across her. This was how it was. 4 years after my interview with Anna Martinovna, I was spending the summer at Murino, a little hamlet near Petersburg, a well-known resort of summer visitors of the middle class. The shooting was pretty decent about Murino at that time, and I used to go out with my gun almost every day. I had a companion on my expeditions, a man of the tradesman class, called Vikulov, a very sensible and good-natured fellow; but, as he said of himself, of no position whatever. This man had been simply everywhere, and everything. Nothing could astonish him, he knew everything, but he cared for nothing but shooting and wine. Well, one day we were on our way home to Murino, and we chanced to pass a solitary house, standing at the cross roads, and enclosed by a high, close paling. It was not the first time I had seen the house, and every time it excited my curiosity. There was something about it mysterious, locked up, grimly dumb, something suggestive of a prison or a hospital. Nothing of it could be seen from the road but its steep, dark, red-painted roof. There was only one pair of gates in the whole fence, and these seemed fastened and never opened. No sound ever came from the other side of them. For all that, we felt that some one was certainly living in the house. It had not at all the air of a deserted dwelling. On the contrary, everything about it was stout, and tight, and strong, as if it would stand a siege. 'What is that fortress?' I asked my companion. 'Don't you know?' Vikulov gave a sly wink. 'A fine building, eh? The police captain of these parts gets a nice little income out of it.' 'How's that?' 'I'll tell you. You've heard, I dare say, of the flagellant dissenters, that do without priests, you know?' 'Yes.' 'Well, it's there that their chief mother lives.' 'A woman?' 'Yes, a mother of God, they say.' 'Nonsense.' 'I tell you it's so. She is a strict one, they say, a regular commander in chief. She rules over thousands. I'd take her, and all these mothers of God, but what's the use of talking?' He called his Pegashka, a marvellous dog, with an excellent scent, but with no notion of setting. Vikulov was obliged to tie her hind paws to keep her from running so furiously. His words sank into my memory. I sometimes went out of my way to pass by the mysterious house. One day I had just got up to it, when suddenly wonderful to relate! A bolt grated in the gates, a key creaked in the lock, then the gates themselves slowly parted, there appeared a large horse's head, with a plated forelock under a decorated yoke, and slowly there rolled into the road a small cart, like those driven by horse dealers and higglers. On the leather cushion of the cart, near to me, sat a peasant of about 30, of a remarkably handsome and attractive appearance, in a neat black smock, and a black cap pulled down low on his forehead. He was carefully driving the well-fed horse, whose sides were as broad as a stove. Beside the peasant, on the far side of the cart, sat a tall woman, as straight as an arrow. Her head was covered by a costly-looking black shawl. She was dressed in a short jerkin of dove-coloured velvet, and a dark blue merino skirt. Her white hands she held discreetly clasped on her bosom. The cart turned on the road to the left, and brought the woman within 2 paces of me. She turned her head a little, and I recognised Evlampia Harlov. I knew her at once, I did not doubt for one instant, and indeed no doubt was possible. Eyes like hers, and above all that cut of the lips, haughty and sensual, I had never seen in any one else. Her face had grown longer and thinner, the skin was darker, here and there lines could be discerned, but above all, the expression of the face was changed. It is difficult to do justice in words to the self-confidence, the sternness, the pride it had gained. Not simply the serenity of power, the satiety of power was visible in every feature. The careless glance she cast at me told of long years of habitually meeting nothing but reverent, unquestioning obedience. That woman clearly lived surrounded, not by worshippers, but by slaves. She had clearly forgotten even the time when any command, any desire of hers was not carried out at the instant. I called her loudly by her name and her father's. She gave a faint start, looked at me a second time, not with alarm, but with contemptuous wrath, as though asking, 'Who dares to disturb me?' and barely parting her lips, uttered a word of command. The peasant sitting beside her started forward, with a wave of his arm struck the horse with the reins, the horse set off at a strong, rapid trot, and the cart disappeared. Since then I have not seen Evlampia again. In what way Martin Petrovitch's daughter came to be a holy virgin in the flagellant sect, I cannot imagine. But who knows, very likely she has founded a sect which will be called, or even now is called, after her name, the Evlampishin sect? Anything may be, anything may come to pass. And so, this is what I had to tell you of my Lear of the Steppes, of his family and his doings.' The story-teller ceased, and we talked a little longer, and then parted, each to his home. End of A Lear of the Steppes. End of Section 10. Section 11 of A Lear of the Steppes, etc. by Ivan Turgenev. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Weimar, 1870. Faust. Goethe. Faust, a story in 9 letters. Entbehren sollst du, sollst entbehren. Faust, Part 1. First letter. From Pavel Alexandrovitch B. to Semyon Nikolaevitch V. M Village, 6th June, 1850. I have been here for 3 days, my dear fellow, and, as I promised, I take up my pen to write to you. It has been drizzling with fine rain ever since the morning. I can't go out, and I want a little chat with you too. Here I am again in my old home, where, it's a dreadful thing to say, I have not been for 9 long years. Really, as you may fancy, I have become quite a different man. Yes, utterly different indeed. Do you remember, in the drawing-room, the little tarnished looking-glass of my great-grandmother's, with the queer little curly scrolls in the corners? You always used to be speculating on what it had seen 100 years ago. Directly I arrived, I went up to it, and I could not help feeling disconcerted. I suddenly saw how old and changed I had become in these last years. But I am not alone in that respect. My little house, which was old and tottering long ago, will hardly hold together now. It is all on the slant, and seems sunk into the ground. My dear Vassilyevna, the housekeeper (you can't have forgotten her, she used to regale you with such capital jam), is quite shrivelled up and bent. When she saw me she could not call out, and did not start crying, but only moaned and choked, sank helplessly into a chair, and waved her hand. Old Terenty has some spirit left in him still. He holds himself up as much as ever, and turns out his feet as he walks. He still wears the same yellow nankeen breeches, and the same creaking goatskin slippers, with high heels and ribbons, which touched you so much sometimes. But, mercy on us, how the breeches flap about his thin legs nowadays! How white his hair has grown! And his face has shrunk up into a sort of little fist. When he speaks to me, when he begins directing the servants, and giving orders in the next room, it makes me laugh and feel sorry for him. All his teeth are gone, and he mumbles with a whistling, hissing sound. On the other hand, the garden has got on wonderfully. The modest little plants of lilac, acacia, and honeysuckle (do you remember we planted them together?) have grown into splendid thick bushes. The birches, the maples, all that has spread out and grown tall. The avenues of lime trees are particularly fine. I love those avenues, I love the tender grey, green colour, and the delicate fragrance of the air under their arching boughs. I love the changing network of rings of light on the dark earth. There is no sand here, you know. My favourite oak sapling has grown into a young oak tree. Yesterday I spent more than an hour in the middle of the day on a garden bench in its shade. I felt very happy. All about me the grass was deliciously luxuriant, a rich soft golden light lay upon everything. It made its way even into the shade. And the birds one could hear! You've not forgotten, I expect, that birds are a passion of mine? The turtle doves cooed unceasingly. From time to time there came the whistle of the oriole, the chaffinch uttered its sweet little refrain. The blackbirds quarrelled and twittered, the cuckoo called far away. Suddenly, like a mad thing, the woodpecker uttered its shrill cry. I listened and listened to this subdued, mingled sound, and did not want to move, while my heart was full of something between languor and tenderness. And it's not only the garden that has grown up. I am continually coming across sturdy, thick-set lads whom I cannot recognise as the little boys I used to know in old days. Your favourite, Timosha, has turned into a Timofey, such as you could never imagine. You had fears in those days for his health, and predicted consumption, but now you should just see his huge red hands as they stick out from the narrow sleeves of his nankeen coat. And the stout rounded muscles that stand out all over him. He has a neck like a bull's, and a head all over tight fair curls, a regular Farnese Hercules. His face, though, has changed less than the others. It is not even much larger in circumference, and the good-humoured, gaping, as you used to say, smile has remained the same. I have taken him to be my valet. I got rid of my Petersburg fellow at Moscow. He was really too fond of putting me to shame, and making me feel the superiority of his Petersburg manners. Of my dogs I have not found one. They have all passed away. Nefka lived longer than any of them, and she did not live till my return, as Argos lived till the return of Ulysses. She was not fated to look once more with her lustreless eyes on her master and companion in the chase. But Shavka is all right, and barks as hoarsely as ever, and has one ear torn, just the same, and burrs sticking to his tail, all just as it should be. I have taken up my abode in what was your room. It is true the sun beats down upon it, and there are a lot of flies in it, but there is less of the smell of the old house in it than in the other rooms. It's a queer thing, that musty, rather sour, faint smell has a powerful effect on my imagination. I don't mean that it's disagreeable to me, quite the contrary, but it produces melancholy, and at last depression. I am very fond, just as you are, of podgy old chests with brass plates, white armchairs with oval backs and crooked legs, fly-blown glass lustres with a big egg of lilac tinsel in the centre, of all sorts of ancestral furniture, in fact. But I can't stand seeing it all continually. A sort of agitated dejection it is just that takes possession of me. In the room where I have established myself, the furniture is of the most ordinary home-made description. I have left, though, in the corner a long narrow set of shelves, on which there is an old-fashioned set of blown green and blue glasses, just discernible through the dust. And I have had hung on the wall that portrait of a woman, you remember, in the black frame, that you used to call the portrait of Manon Lescaut. It has got rather darker in these 9 years, but the eyes have the same pensive, sly, and tender look, the lips have the same capricious, melancholy smile, and the half-plucked rose falls as softly as ever from her slender fingers. I am greatly amused by the blinds in my room. They were once green, but have turned yellow by the sun. On them are depicted, in dark colours, scenes from d'Arlencourt's Hermit. On one curtain the hermit, with an immense beard, goggle eyes and sandals on his feet, is carrying off a young lady with dishevelled locks to the mountains. On another one there is a terrific combat going on between 4 knights wearing berettas, and with puffs on their shoulders. One, much foreshortened, lies slain. In fact, there are pictures of all sorts of horrors, while all about there is such unbroken peace, and the blinds themselves throw such soft light on the ceiling. A sort of inward calm has come upon me since I have been settled here. One wants to do nothing, one wants to see no one, one looks forward to nothing, one is too lazy for thought, but not too lazy for musing. 2 different things, as you know well. Memories of childhood, at first, came flooding upon me. Wherever I went, whatever I looked at, they surged up on all sides, distinct to the smallest detail, and, as it were, immovable in their clearly defined outlines. Then these memories were succeeded by others, then I gradually turned away from the past, and all that was left was a sort of drowsy heaviness in my heart. Fancy, as I was sitting on the dyke under a willow, I suddenly and unexpectedly burst out crying, and should have gone on crying a long while, in spite of my advanced years, if I had not been put to shame by a passing peasant woman who stared at me with curiosity, then, without turning her face towards me, gave a low bow from the waist, and passed on. I should be very glad to remain in the same mood (I shan't do any more crying, of course) till I go away from here, that is, till September, and should be very sorry if any of my neighbours should take it into his head to call on me. However, there is no danger, I fancy, of that. I have no near neighbours here. You will understand me, I'm sure. You know yourself, by experience, how often solitude is beneficial. I need it now after wanderings of all sorts. But I shan't be dull. I have brought a few books with me, and I have a pretty fair library here. Yesterday I opened all the bookcases, and was a long while rummaging about among the musty books. I found many curious things I had not noticed before. Candide, in a manuscript translation of somewhere about 1770. Newspapers and magazines of the same period. The Triumphant Chameleon, that is, Mirabeau. Les Paysans Pervertis, etc. I came across children's books, my own, and my father's, and my grandmother's, and even, fancy, my great-grandmother's. In one dilapidated French grammar, in a parti-coloured binding, was written in fat letters: "Ce livre appartient à Mademoiselle Eudoxie de Lavrine," and it was dated 1741. I saw books I had brought at different times from abroad, among others Goethe's Faust. You're not aware, perhaps, that there was a time when I knew Faust by heart, the first part, of course, word for word. I was never tired of reading it. But other days, other dreams, and for the last 9 years it has so happened that I have scarcely had a Goethe in my hand. It was with an indescribable emotion that I saw the little book I knew so well again, a poor edition of 1828. I brought it away with me, lay down on the bed, and began to read. How all that splendid first scene affected me! The entrance of the spirit of the earth, the words, you remember, on the tide of life in the whirl of creation, stirred a long unfamiliar tremor and shiver of ecstasy. I recalled everything, Berlin, and student days, and Fraulein Clara Stick, and Zeidelmann in the rôle of Mephistopheles, and the music of Radziwill, and all and everything. It was a long while before I could get to sleep. My youth rose up and stood before me like a phantom. It ran like fire, like poison through my veins. My heart leaped and would not be still. Something plucked at its cords, and yearnings began surging up. You see what fantasies your friend gives himself up to at almost 40, where he sits in solitude in his solitary little house. What if any one could have peeped at me? Well, what? I shouldn't have been a bit ashamed of myself. To be ashamed is a sign of youth, too. And I have begun, do you know now, to notice that I'm getting old. I'll tell you how. I try in these days to make as much as I can of my happy sensations, and to make little of my sad ones, and in the days of my youth I did just the opposite. At times one used to carry about one's melancholy as if it were a treasure, and be ashamed of a cheerful mood. But for all that, it strikes me, that in spite of all my experiences of life, there is something in the world, friend Horatio, which I have not experienced, and that something almost the most important. Oh, what have I worked myself up to? Farewell for the present. What are you about in Petersburg? By the way, Savely, my country cook, wishes to send his duty to you. He too is older, but not very much so. He is grown rather corpulent, stouter all over. He is as good as ever at chicken soup, with stewed onions, cheesecakes with goffered edges, and pea-goose. Pea-goose is the famous dish of the steppes, which makes your tongue white and rough for 24 hours after. On the other hand, he roasts the meat as he always did, so that you can hammer on the plate with it, hard as a board. But I must really say good bye. Yours, P. B. End of Section 11.